Two-way tables. We can also organize data gathered in a two-way table. Two-way tables display information as it pertains to two different categories. Here is an example of a two-way table. What does the two-way table show us? Well, first, the table below shows information gathered from 30 students. They were asked if they took a bus or a bicycle to school. So as you can see from the table, some students take the bus, while other students ride their bicycles, while some take the bus or ride a bicycle to school. And we also have several students who do not take a bus nor ride their bicycles to school. We have to look at each row and column to decipher that information. So now we can answer some questions using the data from the table. Now let's go through the process and steps of making a two-way table. So here we have the information that Henry studied students from several classes to find out if they did chores and received an allowance. 65 students did chores. Of those 65 students, 49 received an allowance. There were 26 students that did not do chores and did not receive an allowance, and 10 students that did not do chores but received an allowance. So the first thing we do is set up our table like so, and we label the categories. We're then going to dissect the given information and see where we're putting these numbers in our two-way table. So the first piece of information is that 65 students did chores. So where would you write that number? Well, the important thing to note is that the chores and the no chores categories are in the rows, and the allowance and the no allowance categories are in the columns. So if we're talking about 65 students did chores, we have a total for the chores row. So we're going to place 65 here at the end of the chores row. Now we know that of those 65 students, 49 received an allowance. So where would you write the 49? Well, we would start at the chores category, but then we would look at the allowance category since the 49 students who did chores received an allowance. So 49 is going in the first box here. Next, we also know that there were 26 students that did not do chores and did not receive an allowance. So we would look at the no chores category and the no allowance category to write the 26 here. Finally, we know that 10 students did not do chores but received an allowance. So if we look for the no chores category and then the allowance category, we can write 10 in this box here. So this is the table filled using the information that was given. Although some of the cells are not filled, we can easily find the rest of the information with simple math. Think if we're looking for totals, we can either add numbers together, or if we know the total and a part of the total, we can subtract the numbers to find the other part. So finding the no allowance and chores, we can subtract the 65 total from the 49 students who do chores and get an allowance from the 65 students that do chores and get 16. For the total students that get an allowance no matter what, we can add the column of 49 plus 10 to get 59. For the column of no allowance no matter what, we can add the 16 students plus the 26 students to get 42 students. And then our total, we have a choice of adding the total from the rows or the total from the columns, and either way we should end up with 101. If we did our math correctly, in fact, the total row and column should be the same, which we can see it is. So here is the final table where we filled in all the parts of the two-way table, and now we can answer some questions using the data. Using two-way tables, we can calculate something called relative frequencies. Relative frequencies are ratios that compare the value of a certain category to the subtotal in that category. As you have previously learned, the frequency is the quantity of just how many of a certain event occurs. Relative frequency is how many compared to the subtotal. The relative frequency is then written as a fraction or decimal. So here's an example. There are 12 girls in a class of 20 students. So the frequency of number of girls in a class is 12, but the relative frequency of the number of girls in the class is 12 over 20, or 12 divided by 20, which is 0.60. So here we have our two-way table, and we want to calculate the relative frequency for this two-way table. From earlier, we looked at, this was our example with, we were comparing students who took the bus and rode their bicycle to school versus students that took both, or students that didn't take either or one or the other. But we're going to, again, calculate the relative frequency. We're first going to do it by row and then by column. So first, if we do it by row, for this cell here, the relative frequency of students taking a bicycle to school or the bus to school is divided by the total number of students that take the bus to school, because again, we're going by row. So that was 5, the students that took a bicycle or bus to school, over the total students that took a bus to school of 12. So that relative frequency is 5 over 12, or 0.42. And you can see we can do that for all the cells in the table, again, going by row. You then can take the relative frequency by column. So for that same cell, we're looking at the number of students that take a bicycle or a bus to school, still 5, but now we're dividing by the number of students that take a bicycle to school. That was 11. So you can see then the relative frequency would be 5 over 11, which is approximately 0.45. So let's answer some questions now using the relative frequencies. First, let's look at by row. So we can ask, what is the relative frequency of students that take a bicycle to school and also take a bus to school to all the students taking a bus to school? So we would look at this cell here, because again, we start with the students that take a bicycle or a bus to school, which is that first category, and then it's to all the students taking a bus, which is looking at the relative frequency by row, which is already calculated. So we can see the relative frequency is 5 over 12, which is approximately 0.42. Then we can ask, again, still looking at by row, what is the relative frequency of students that do not take a bicycle to school and do not take a bus to all the students who do not take a bus to school? So now first we look for this cell of students who do not take a bicycle to school and who do not take a bus to school. That would be this cell here. So we've already calculated the relative frequency by row, which is comparing that number to all the students who do not take a bus to school. So it would be 12 over 18, which is approximately 0.67. So using the relative frequency, we can answer more questions about the two-way table. Let's look at another example with different data. We're going to use the following two-way table that's comparing students that have allowance with chores and allowance with no chores versus chores with no allowance and no chores with no allowance. And we're going to use that information to calculate the relative frequency by row. So we are going to take each cell in the table and we are going to then put it over as a fraction, comparing it to the totals in the rows. So we'll have 49 over 65, 16 over 65, 10 over 36, 26 over 36, 59 over 101, 42 over 101. So we have these relative frequencies. Now, why do we calculate relative frequencies? Well, we can use relative frequencies to determine if there is an association between the two categories. So, for example, does there seem to be a relationship between whether or not a student receives an allowance compared to whether or not a student does chores? So we're looking at the allowance category and then the chores versus no chores categories. So we can see that approximately 0.75 or 75% of students that receive an allowance do chores. But out of those that do chores, only 0.25 or 25% of students receive no allowance. So we can compare and see that more students who do chores receive allowance, and there's a very small or a less amount of students that do chores and receive no allowance. We can compare them. Now let's look at the relative frequencies by column. So now we're looking at 49 over 59, 10 over 59. We're looking at the totals at the bottom of the two columns, 16 over 42, 26 over 42, 65 over 101, 36 over 101. And we're getting those relative frequencies. So now we can answer the question, is there a relationship between students that do chores to the amount of students that receive an allowance? So now we can see that approximately 0.83 or 83% of students that receive an allowance do chores. And out of those students that receive an allowance, only 0.17 or 17% of students completed no chores. So we can see again that there's many more students that do chores and receive an allowance versus students who don't do chores and still receive that allowance. We can make that comparison by looking at the relative frequencies. To answer more questions about relative frequencies, let's construct a two-way table using the following information. We have that Kelly found that 49 people had dogs in her school. Out of the 49 people, 30 had cats, 50 people had cats in her school, and 22 people had neither cats nor dogs at home. So let's fill in our known information. We know that 22 people had neither cats nor dogs at home. So we're going to go to the no cat and no dog categories in the table. So that takes care of that information. We have that 49 people had dogs in her school, so the total of the dogs category is 49. We know out of the 49 people, 30 had cats also, so those would be people with dogs and cats, so that would be 30 in the dog and cat category. And then 50 people, for a total of 50, had cats, so we can put 50 in the total category. So there is our two-way table filled in with the information we do know. Now using those numbers, we can fill in the cells that we don't. We can do 50 minus 30 to figure out how many people own cats and no dogs. We can do 49 minus 30 to figure out how many people have only a dog and no cat. And once we know that number, we can add that together to give us a total for the people who have no cats. And we can find out the total of students in her school that have no dogs by adding this row. And then we can find out the totals by looking at the totals in the columns and the rows to find out our total students that participated. Performing those calculations, here we have our two-way table. We have a total of 91 students participated in the survey. We have 30 students have both cats and dogs. We have 50 students that have cats with 20 that have no dogs. We have 19 students who have a dog with no cat and 49 total students that have dogs. We have 22 students that have no dog or no cat, and we have 42 total students with no dog and 41 students with no cat. So now we can use this information to calculate relative frequencies.